worlds that sent their sons to die in the Emperor's name. The Imperium erased them anyway and made sure everyone watched. This isn't about war, it's about what happens when fear becomes policy. And the worst part? It actually worked. I was not there when the first planet died. I was safe in the upper tiers of the Segmentum Fortress, watching through data feeds as Carthax Prime burned, and I remember thinking how clean it looked from orbit, how orderly the destruction appeared when rendered through tactical overlays and thermal gradients. The world had been loyal. Its tithes arrived on schedule for 3 centuries. Its regiments marched without complaint into the maw of distant wars, and its people prayed to the Golden Throne with the kind of desperate fervor that marks true faith. They did not rebel. They did not harbor heretics. They simply existed in the wrong sector at the wrong time, and that was enough. The doctrine had no name yet when the first calculations were run. It existed only as a series of probability matrices, casualty projections stacked against predicted rebellion rates in neighboring systems. The Munitorum analysts who drafted the initial reports did not think of themselves as architects of genocide. They thought of themselves as problem solvers, men and women who understood that the Imperium's resources were finite and its enemies limitless. The question they posed was not whether innocent lives could be sacrificed, but how many innocent lives would achieve maximum strategic effect. They worked in silence, their quills scratching across parchment in offices that smelled of countersink oil and recycled air, and when they finished, they submitted their findings without ceremony. The recommendation was simple: destroy a compliant world, broadcast the destruction. Let the images saturate every Vox channel, every data slate, every propaganda feed across a dozen systems. Show the populace of every nearby planet what the Imperium was capable of doing, not to traitors, not to Xenos, not to heretics, but to the faithful. Let them see that loyalty offered no protection, that obedience guaranteed nothing, that the God Emperor's mercy extended only as far as strategic necessity allowed. The analysts believed that such a demonstration would create a psychological pressure wave, a zone of preemptive terror that would suppress rebellion before it could metastasize. They believed that fear, properly calibrated, could replace entire battle groups. They were correct. The Lord Commander who authorized the operation never visited Carthax Prime. He reviewed the projections in his quarters, a windowless chamber deep within the fortress where the walls were lined with tactical maps and the air tasted of incense and old leather. He was an old man, his face a topography of scars and augmetic replacements, his eyes the color of ship steel. He had fought in the Macarian Crusade, had seen the Imperium stretch itself thin across lightless voids, had watched entire armies vanish into the silent dark because supply lines collapsed, or commanders miscalculated, or the warp itself twisted the routes into knots. He understood logistical attrition better than most, understood that wars were won not by heroism but by the patient application of resources against carefully selected targets. When he signed the order, his hand did not shake. The Carthax suppression doctrine, as it came to be called, was implemented with the kind of precision that defined imperial bureaucracy at its most efficient. The 47th Expeditionary Fleet was redirected from garrison duty and given new orders. No explanation was provided to the ship captains, no justification offered to the regiment commanders. They were simply told to sterilize a planet and ensure the process was recorded in exacting detail. Some of the officers hesitated. Some requested clarification. One captain refused outright and was executed for dereliction of duty, his body jettisoned into the void without ceremony. The rest complied. Carthax Prime had no orbital defenses worth mentioning. Its void shields were civilian-grade, designed to deflect debris and minor asteroid impacts, not military bombardment. The planetary governor transmitted a confused plea for explanation when the fleet entered high orbit, his voice crackling through Vox static as he asked what crimes his world had committed, what heresy they had harbored, what failure of faith had brought the Imperium's wrath down upon them. No answer was given. The bombardment began 7 minutes later. The first strike vaporized the planetary capital. 3 billion souls erased in a column of light that burned so hot it glassed the surrounding terrain for 50 kilometers in every direction. The shockwave rippled outward, collapsing hab blocks and shattering infrastructure, and in the moments before the firestorm consumed them, the people of Carthax Prime looked up and saw their sky turn to fire. There was no time for prayer, no time for understanding. They died confused, their faith intact, their loyalty unquestioned. The bombardment continued for 16 hours. Every population center, every industrial hub, every agricultural zone was targeted with the same methodical thoroughness. The orbital strikes were staggered to maximize atmospheric dispersal of radioactive particulate, ensuring that even those who survived the initial impacts would die slowly from radiation poisoning or atmospheric collapse. The fleet's tech priests monitored the process with detached interest, recording thermal readings and blast radii, noting the efficiency of various warhead configurations. When the bombardment concluded, Carthax Prime was a smoking cinder, its atmosphere a toxic soup of ash and ionized gases, its population reduced to statistical zero. The documentation was flawless. Every moment of the destruction was captured by high-resolution pict feeds. Every scream filtered through audio arrays, every thermal bloom analyzed and catalogued. The data was compiled into a comprehensive visual record that lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes, a relentless chronicle of annihilation that left nothing to the imagination. This record was then transmitted across the sector via every available communications channel. It interrupted Vox broadcasts, overrode propaganda reels, appeared on data slates in administratum offices and factory floors and troop transports. The Imperium wanted every citizen in the surrounding systems to see what had been done, to understand that no world was safe, that loyalty was no shield, that the God Emperor's protection was a lie told to children. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Within 2 weeks, 17 nascent rebellions in neighboring systems collapsed without a shot fired. Resistance cells that had been stockpiling weapons and recruiting quietly for months simply dissolved, their members too terrified to continue. Planetary governors who had entertained thoughts of secession or negotiating with rival factions abandoned such notions entirely, their resolve shattered by the images of Carthax Prime's death. Workers who had planned strikes or protests returned to their labor without complaint, their grievances suddenly insignificant, measured against the threat of orbital annihilation. The entire sector fell into a paralyzed silence. Every world gripped by the understanding that rebellion was not merely futile but suicidal. The Munitorum analysts reviewed the data with satisfaction. Casualty rates in the sector dropped by 63% within the first month. Resource expenditure on counterinsurgency operations fell to negligible levels. Tithe compliance reached unprecedented highs as governors scrambled to demonstrate their loyalty through overproduction and zealous obedience. The strategic objectives had been achieved at a fraction of the cost of conventional military suppression. The analysts prepared a follow-up report recommending the expansion of the doctrine to other unstable regions, their tone professional and clinical, their language stripped of moral consideration. I read that report in my quarters late one night, the only illumination coming from the flickering glow of the data slate. Outside my window, the void stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent. And I thought about the 3 billion people who had died so that charts could trend upward, so that logistics could be streamlined, so that the Imperium could save resources for wars yet unfought. I thought about the children on Carthax Prime, about the mothers and fathers and workers and priests, about the soldiers who had marched off to die in the Emperor's name on distant battlefields, never knowing that their home would be erased not as punishment but as policy. I thought about these things, and then I filed the report in the appropriate archive and moved on to the next task. The second implementation of the Carthax suppression doctrine occurred 6 months later on a world called Velmara Secundus. This time the process was refined, the methodology sharpened by lessons learned from Carthax Prime. Velmara Secundus was selected not because it showed signs of rebellion, but because its destruction would create maximum psychological impact across 3 subsectors simultaneously. Its population was smaller, only 900 million, but it occupied a critical junction in regional trade routes, and its annihilation would resonate across a wider economic network. The fleet that arrived was smaller, but more specialized. Rather than a prolonged bombardment, the strategists opted for a single apocalyptic strike using a modified cyclonic torpedo that would crack the planet's crust and trigger catastrophic tectonic collapse. The result would be slower, more visually dramatic, a death that would unfold over days rather than hours, giving ample time for the suffering to be documented and broadcast. The torpedo struck the polar continent during the height of the local workday. The initial impact was almost gentle, a deep tremor that rattled windows and knocked goods from shelves, something the population might have mistaken for a minor quake, if not for the alarm sirens that began wailing immediately afterward. Within minutes, fissures began spreading across the continent's surface, glowing veins of molten rock that split hab blocks and swallowed entire city districts. The atmosphere filled with ash and sulfur, the sky darkening to a perpetual twilight as volcanic eruptions bloomed across the horizon. The people of Velmara Secundus did not die quickly. They had time to understand what was happening, time to crowd into churches and scream their prayers at statues of the God Emperor, time to watch their world tear itself apart, while the orbital Pict feeds recorded every moment of their desperation. The planet's governor transmitted a final Vox message before communications collapsed, a broken, rambling plea in which he listed every tithe his world had delivered, every regiment they had raised, every sacrifice they had made in the Emperor's name. He asked what they had done wrong. He asked why their faith had not been enough. No one answered him. The death of Velmara Secundus took 11 days. The tectonic collapse spread from continent to continent, the planet's crust fracturing like eggshell as the mantle vomited itself across the surface. Oceans boiled into steam, cities sank into newly formed chasms, and the survivors huddled in the last remaining safe zones, watching their numbers dwindle as atmosphere vented into space and the temperature plummeted. The Pict feeds captured everything. The children crying in their parents' arms, the priests leading final prayers as the ground opened beneath them, the slow realization that no rescue was coming, that they had been abandoned not for treason but for strategy. When it was over, Velmara Secundus was a dead rock, its surface a maze of broken continents and cooling magma. The documentation was even more comprehensive than Carthax Prime. The footage edited into a brutally efficient narrative that emphasized the inevitability of the world's destruction, the powerlessness of faith or loyalty to alter what had been decreed. This record was broadcast with even greater saturation than before, flooding every communications network in 3 subsectors, overriding emergency channels and military frequencies alike. The Imperium ensured that no citizen could escape seeing what had happened, that the images would burn themselves into the collective consciousness of every world within range. The results exceeded projections. 42 rebellions across the 3 subsectors collapsed within a month. Entire resistance movements disintegrated as their members fled into obscurity or turned themselves in to local authorities, desperate to demonstrate their loyalty. Governors who had shown even faint signs of independence scrambled to prove their submission, some going so far as to execute their own advisors on suspicion of seditious thought. Worker productivity surged as the populace threw themselves into their labor with frantic energy, terrified that any lapse might be interpreted as disloyalty. The Munitorum reports glowed with success metrics. Resource expenditure on suppression campaigns had been reduced by 71%. Tithe delivery timelines had shortened by an average of 18 days. Compliance indices had reached levels not seen since the Great Crusade. The analysts prepared expansion recommendations with growing confidence, their models now including predictive algorithms for selecting optimal target worlds, calculating population size versus strategic resonance, balancing shock value against resource cost. The Lord Commander reviewed these reports with the same expressionless calm he had shown when authorizing the first strike. He understood what was being built here, understood that the Carthax suppression doctrine was evolving from emergency measure into standard operational procedure. He understood that the Imperium was learning how to weaponize fear with the same precision it applied to void combat or armored assaults, and he understood that this would change the nature of compliance enforcement forever. He authorized the next phase. Over the following 3 years, the Carthax suppression doctrine was implemented 17 more times across 4 segmentums. Each strike was carefully calibrated, each target world selected for maximum psychological leverage. Some were destroyed quickly, others slowly. Some died to bombardment, others to biological agents or atmospheric ignition or induced stellar flares. The methods varied, but the documentation remained constant, comprehensive, unflinching, designed to overwhelm any capacity for rationalization or denial. The cumulative death toll exceeded 40 billion souls. Every one of them had been loyal. Every one of them had served the Imperium without question, had raised their children to venerate the Golden Throne, had sent their sons and daughters to die in distant wars, had labored in the Emperor's name without complaint or hesitation. Their worlds had been clean of heresy, free of Xenos taint, obedient to every dictate issued from distant terror. They had done everything right, and it had not mattered. The Imperium killed them anyway, because their deaths were useful. I watched the sector maps change over those 3 years, watched entire systems disappear from the logistics networks, watched trade routes shift and tithe projections recalculate around the newly empty spaces. The analysts generated increasingly sophisticated models, their algorithms growing more refined with each implementation, their ability to predict psychological cascade effects sharpening to an art. They could now calculate with 87% accuracy which neighboring systems would experience compliance surges based on the method of a target world's destruction. They could predict rebellion collapse timelines down to the week. They could optimize death for maximum strategic yield. The doctrine became routine. Fleet captains who had once hesitated now carried out sterilization orders without question, their crews numbed to the work through repetition. Tech priests refined bombardment patterns and improved documentation quality, treating each new implementation as an opportunity to perfect their craft. Munitorum officials filed casualty reports alongside supply requisitions, the numbers blending into the endless data streams that kept the Imperium functioning. No one spoke about morality. No one questioned the necessity. The results were too clear, the effectiveness too undeniable. The Carthax suppression doctrine worked precisely because it removed humanity from the equation, because it transformed billions of lives into variables in a formula, because it understood that fear calibrated to this degree of precision could accomplish what entire armies could not. The rebellions that did not happen were never recorded. The wars that were avoided left no scars in the historical record. The resources that were saved fed other campaigns, bolstered other fronts, extended the Imperium's reach into sectors that would have been unreachable if conventional suppression methods had been employed. The doctrine's success was written in negatives, in conflicts that never materialized, in casualties that never accumulated, in the grim mathematics of lives traded for stability. But the silence grew heavier. I began to notice it in the way officers spoke to each other in the corridors of the Segmentum Fortress, the careful euphemisms they employed when discussing target selection, the way conversations about the doctrine always carried the brittle quality of people speaking around something they refused to name directly. I noticed it in the way younger analysts grew older, faster, the way their eyes dulled and their postures stiffened as they compiled projection after projection, sterilization report after sterilization report. I noticed it in the increased demand for sedative regimens among the picked feed operators, the men and women who spent their days watching worlds die and editing the footage into maximum psychological impact. The doctrine was working. The doctrine was working better than anyone had imagined possible. And that was perhaps the most terrible thing of all, because there was no end point, no threshold at which the killing would stop. The analysts had discovered that the fear generated by each implementation degraded over time, that populations adapted to horror through exposure, that the psychological pressure required constant reinforcement to maintain effectiveness. Their models predicted that long-term stability would require periodic re-implementation, that every few years another loyal world would need to be sacrificed to refresh the terror, to remind the Imperium citizens that their obedience guaranteed nothing, that their faith was irrelevant, measured against strategic necessity. The doctrine had proven that compliance could be purchased with mathematically optimized cruelty, that rebellion could be suppressed through the careful application of despair, that the Imperium could rule not through strength or justice or even faith, but through the cold manipulation of psychological breaking points. It had proven that this approach was more efficient than any alternative. And so the killing continued. I stood at the observation deck one night, looking out at the stars, and I thought about all the worlds that had died, all the people who had prayed to the God Emperor as the sky turned to fire, all the children who had died confused and terrified in their parents' arms. I thought about the analysts working in their offices, running their calculations, selecting the next target from a list of compliant worlds. I thought about the fleet captains preparing their ships, the tech priests calibrating their weapons, the picked feed operators setting up their equipment. I thought about how none of this was secret, how the documentation was broadcast deliberately, how the Imperium wanted everyone to see what it was capable of doing, how the horror was the point, how the cruelty was not incidental but essential, how the doctrine functioned precisely because it was public, because it forced every citizen to confront the reality that their lives meant nothing beyond their utility to strategic objectives. I thought about how it worked, how it actually worked. The fourth year of the doctrine's implementation began with the sterilization of Ghast Major, a shrine world that had stood for 2,000 years as a monument to the Emperor's divinity. Its population of 600 million spent their lives in prayer and penance, its cathedrals rising like mountains of stone and stained glass, its air thick with incense and hymns. The world produced nothing of material value, its only export faith itself, and perhaps that was why it was selected. The Imperium wanted to demonstrate that even holiness offered no protection, that devotion was meaningless when measured against operational requirements. The bombardment came during the height of a holy festival, when millions had gathered in the Grand Plaza before the Cathedral of Eternal Vigil, when the air sang with choral voices and the smell of burning candles mixed with the smoke of offering fires. The first strike hit the cathedral itself, a lance beam that punched through the ornate dome and vaporized the high altar in a flash of superheated plasma. The shockwave toppled the surrounding spires, brought the massive structure crashing down on the thousands of worshippers inside, their prayers cut short by the screaming collapse of stone. The killing took 3 days. Every cathedral, every shrine, every monument to faith was targeted with deliberate precision. The picked feeds captured pilgrims running through streets that burned beneath them, captured priests raising holy relics toward the burning sky as if sanctified objects could ward off Imperial warships, captured the moment when the faithful finally understood that the God Emperor was not coming to save them, that their devotion had been insufficient, that they had failed in some unknowable way. The broadcasts from Ghast Major were particularly effective. The sight of a shrine world burning, of cathedrals reduced to rubble, of the faithful dying while clutching prayer beads and scripture scrolls, struck a chord of existential terror that secular worlds could not match. If holiness offered no sanctuary, what could? If a world dedicated entirely to worship could be erased without explanation, what hope did ordinary worlds possess? The psychological cascade was immediate and profound. Across 17 sectors, faith-based resistance movements collapsed overnight. Ecclesiarchy officials who had quietly harbored reformist sympathies recanted their positions publicly, some going so far as to burn their own writings and denounce themselves before assembled congregations. Workers in manufactorums redoubled their efforts, terrified that any lapse might suggest spiritual weakness. Governors commissioned new monuments to the emperor's glory, each trying to outdo the others in displays of devotion, desperate to prove their worlds worthy of survival. The Munitorum reports noted a 23% increase in voluntary tithe contributions and a 41% reduction in prayer-related work stoppages. The analysts calculated that the destruction of Ghast Major had generated more compliance value per casualty than any previous implementation, that targeting faith itself had proven more effective than simple terror. New recommendations followed. The models suggested that periodically destroying worlds of symbolic importance, worlds that represented ideals like faith or sacrifice or perseverance, would maintain psychological pressure more efficiently than random selection. The Imperium began compiling lists of such worlds, categorizing them by symbolic resonance, calculating optimal intervals between strikes to maximize fear without inducing total despair. Because total despair, the analysts noted, was counterproductive. People crushed into complete hopelessness stopped working, stopped fighting, stopped contributing anything of value. The goal was calibrated terror, a carefully maintained state where populations remained functional but too frightened to resist, where they worked harder out of fear, while still clinging to the faint hope that obedience might save them. The doctrine was evolving into something more sophisticated than simple atrocity. It was becoming a comprehensive system of psychological control, a method of governance that understood human breaking points with scientific precision and exploited them with bureaucratic efficiency. I attended a planning session in the 8th month of the 4th year, sitting among analysts and strategic officers as they reviewed target options for the next implementation. The discussion was technical, focused on casualty projections and broadcast saturation ratios, on the optimal timing for maximum psychological leverage. Someone suggested a forge world, arguing that destroying industrial capacity would demonstrate the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice economic value for compliance. Someone else countered that such a target would be interpreted as punishment for insufficient production, which might actually encourage work slowdowns out of fear. The debate continued for 2 hours, calm and professional, a discussion about which of the Emperor's loyal worlds should die next. I said nothing. I had learned by then that objections were futile, that questioning the doctrine was itself a form of disloyalty, that the only acceptable response was silent compliance. The other attendees had learned the same lesson. We sat in our chairs and reviewed the projections and offered technical observations stripped of moral content, and when the session ended, we filed our reports and moved on to the next task. The selected target was Valdane's Hope, an agri-world that had fed 3 sectors for 6 centuries. Its vast grain fields stretching to every horizon, its people simple and hard-working, their lives measured in harvests and seasons. The world had no military value, no strategic importance beyond food production, and that was precisely the point. The Imperium wanted to show that even essential worlds that fed the machine, could be discarded if their destruction served a greater purpose. The method chosen was biological rather than orbital. A tailored plague was introduced into the water supply, something the Munitorum bioshapers had engineered specifically for maximum suffering and documentation value. The plague killed slowly, over the course of weeks, its symptoms both horrific and impossible to hide. The infected developed lesions that wept blood and pus, their skin turning black and splitting open, their bodies consuming themselves from within, while their minds remained clear enough to understand what was happening. The picked feeds from Valdane's Hope were the worst yet. They showed families dying together in their hab units, showed farmers collapsing in their fields while the grain grew untended around them, showed medics overwhelmed by casualties they could not treat, reduced to simply recording deaths as they occurred. The plague spread across the entire world within 4 weeks, and within 6 weeks 98% of the population was dead or dying. The survivors, too few to maintain basic infrastructure, slowly starved as the agri-systems failed and the food ran out. The broadcasts from Valdane's Hope were shorter than previous implementations but more viscerally effective. The images of plague victims, of bodies piled in mass graves, of children covered in lesions crying for parents who were already dead, created a horror that bombardment could not match. This was not the clean violence of orbital strikes, but something intimate and inescapable. Something that crawled inside you and killed you slowly while everyone you loved died around you. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Food riots that had been brewing on 17 worlds evaporated overnight as workers realized that starvation was preferable to attracting imperial attention. Agricultural collectives that had been demanding better conditions fell silent, their representatives withdrawing every petition and grievance. Governors of agri-worlds scrambled to increase production quotas, terrified that insufficient output might mark them as the next example. The Munitorum calculated that the destruction of Valdane's Hope had generated compliance value equivalent to 3 conventional military campaigns, and had done so while actually increasing net food production across the affected sectors. The models suggested that destroying essential infrastructure worlds created a unique psychological dynamic, forcing populations to choose between starvation and obedience, a choice that reliably resulted in increased productivity. More recommendations followed, more lists were compiled, more methodologies were refined. The 5th year saw the doctrine expand into new theaters. 7 worlds died that year, each selected for specific symbolic or strategic value, each destroyed using methods calculated to maximize psychological impact on surrounding systems. A hive world was sterilized during rush hour, its billions caught in transit when the atmospheric igniters activated, their bodies carbonized in the arcologies and transit tunnels. A penal world was bombarded while its population watched on in forced pict feeds, forced to witness their own destruction as punishment for crimes they had not committed. A fortress world was cracked open by sustained lance fire, its military installations and trained regiments erased to demonstrate that martial strength offered no immunity. Each death was documented. Each broadcast was optimized. Each result was analyzed and incorporated into ever more sophisticated predictive models, and the Imperium grew quieter, not peaceful, not stable in any meaningful sense, but quiet with the silence of populations too terrified to speak, too broken to resist, too numbed by horror to do anything but comply with whatever was demanded of them. The sectors under the doctrine's influence became model regions of efficiency, their tithe compliance perfect, their rebellion rates negligible, their populations docile and productive. The analysts wrote glowing reports about sustainability and long-term strategic gain. The Lord Commanders nodded their approval and authorized expanded implementation. The fleet captains carried out their orders with mechanical precision, their crews too habituated to question what they were doing. The entire apparatus of the Carthax suppression doctrine functioned with the smooth efficiency of a well-maintained machine, each component performing its designated function without hesitation or moral consideration. The horror lay in how well it worked. I sat in my quarters on the night the 5th anniversary report was distributed, reading through page after page of success metrics and efficiency gains, and projected long-term benefits. The report concluded that the Carthax suppression doctrine had achieved its strategic objectives beyond all initial projections, that it had proven itself the most cost-effective compliance enforcement mechanism in modern imperial history, that its expansion to additional theaters was not merely recommended, but essential for maintaining the Imperium's stability in an age of infinite war. The report made no mention of the 40 billion dead. It did not discuss the children or the faithful or the loyal workers who had died confused and terrified. It did not acknowledge that the Imperium had learned to govern through mathematically optimized despair, that it had systematized cruelty to the point where horror became policy and atrocity became routine. It simply noted that rebellion rates were down and resource expenditure was optimized and tithe compliance was at historic highs. It noted that the strategy worked. Outside my window, the void stretched endlessly, filled with stars that represented worlds uncounted, populations beyond measure, billions upon billions of souls laboring in the Emperor's name. I wondered how many of them knew about the doctrine, how many had seen the broadcasts, how many lay awake at night wondering if their world would be next. I wondered if they prayed more fervently, worked harder, held their children tighter, all in the desperate hope that perfect obedience might save them. I wondered if they understood that it would not matter. Because the doctrine did not care about obedience, it did not care about loyalty or faith or sacrifice. It cared only about strategic effect, about maintaining the calibrated terror that kept populations compliant, about the cold mathematics of fear versus rebellion versus resource expenditure. A world could be perfect in its devotion and still be selected for destruction if the analysts determined that its death would generate optimal psychological leverage in the surrounding systems. The arbitrariness was essential. The randomness was the point. Because if loyalty could save you, then the terror would have a boundary, a limit beyond which you were safe. But if loyalty meant nothing, if even the most faithful could be erased without warning or reason, then there was no safety anywhere, no action you could take to protect yourself except perfect compliance in every moment. The doctrine understood this, the analysts understood this, the Imperium understood this. And so the killing continued. Year after year, world after world, each death optimized for maximum strategic effect, each broadcast carefully edited to maintain the perfect pitch of existential dread that kept billions obedient and productive and silent. I thought about the analyst who had drafted the original proposal, the man or woman who had first suggested that destroying loyal worlds might be strategically valuable. I wondered if they felt pride at seeing their theory vindicated, satisfaction at creating such an effective mechanism of control. I wondered if they slept well at night, or if the numbers haunted them, if they ever thought about the faces behind the casualty statistics, the prayers that went unanswered, the faith that proved worthless. I wondered if they were still alive, still working somewhere in the depths of the Munitorum bureaucracy, still running calculations and optimizing death. I wondered if it mattered. The 6th year brought refinements to target selection protocols. The analysts had noticed diminishing returns in certain sectors where the doctrine had been implemented multiple times, where populations had grown partially desensitized to horror through repeated exposure. Their solution was to introduce variation, to alternate between different methods of destruction, different symbolic targets, different pacing of implementations. They theorized that unpredictability would prevent psychological adaptation, that maintaining uncertainty about when and how the next strike would occur would sustain fear more effectively than predictable patterns. The theory was tested across 4 subsectors, each receiving different implementation schedules. One saw strikes every 3 months, another every 8 months, another at random intervals, another with long periods of silence followed by multiple rapid strikes. Each method was tracked and analyzed, casualty counts measured against compliance indices and rebellion suppression rates. The random interval approach proved most effective. Populations subjected to unpredictable strikes maintained higher baseline terror and demonstrated more consistent compliance than those operating under fixed schedules. The analysts theorized that the inability to predict or prepare for strikes created a state of permanent tension, a background anxiety that never resolved into either acceptance or active resistance. New protocols were drafted. Implementation schedules were randomized across multiple sectors. The doctrine evolved from systematic program into something more like weather, something that could strike anywhere, at any time without warning or pattern. Something that populations could neither predict nor defend against. The 7th year saw the introduction of partial implementations, a refinement suggested by a junior analyst who argued that total planetary sterilization, while maximally effective in the short term, might be leaving strategic value on the table. Her proposal was to leave survivors, small populations deliberately spared from destruction, witnesses who could spread first-hand accounts of what had happened, living testaments to imperial power and ruthlessness. The first test of this methodology occurred on Crevasse Prime, a mining world where 80% of the population was killed by precision strikes that targeted specific hab sectors while leaving others untouched. The survivors emerged from their shelters to find their world gutted, entire districts reduced to smoking craters, while their own hab blocks stood intact through no action or merit of their own. They were left with working Vox equipment and functioning data slates, given every tool necessary to transmit their experiences across nearby systems. The psychological effect of survivor testimony proved devastating. Hearing about planetary destruction from official broadcasts was one thing. Hearing it from neighbors, from people who had witnessed their families die, from workers who described the arbitrary nature of survival and death, created a horror that propaganda could not match. The randomness was visceral in a way that strategic reports could never convey. The understanding that survival had nothing to do with worthiness or faith or action, that you lived or died based on coordinates in a targeting algorithm. The analysts documented a 47% increase in compliance efficiency in systems exposed to survivor testimony compared to those receiving only official broadcasts. Recommendations followed for expanded use of partial implementations, protocols for selecting survivor populations, methodologies for ensuring their testimonies were properly distributed. The doctrine was learning, evolving, growing more sophisticated with each iteration. What had begun as a blunt instrument of terror was becoming a scalpel, capable of precise psychological cuts calibrated to achieve specific effects. The Imperium was discovering that fear could be engineered with the same precision as Prometheum refinement or void shield harmonics, that human psychology followed predictable patterns when subjected to properly designed stimuli. I attended more planning sessions during the 7th year than any previous period, my administrative role requiring presence at increasingly technical discussions of psychological warfare theory. I sat silent while experts debated the optimal survivor ratio for different world types, while they argued about whether children or adults made better witnesses, while they calculated the long-term psychological degradation of populations exposed to varying frequencies of partial implementations. The discussions were always professional, always clinical, always focused on optimization and efficiency. No one spoke about right or wrong. No one questioned whether the Imperium should be doing this. The only debates were technical: how to do it better, how to achieve more with less, how to refine the methodology until it approached theoretical perfection. Sometimes I caught myself participating, offering observations about data patterns, suggesting analytical approaches, identifying inefficiencies in current protocols. I told myself I was just doing my job, just fulfilling my administrative function within the machine. But late at night, reading through implementation reports and casualty statistics, I wondered if I was any different from the analysts who selected the targets, from the fleet captains who carried out the strikes, from the picked feed operators who edited the footage. We were all part of the same mechanism, all components in the same machine, all complicit in the same methodical atrocity. The 8th year brought the doctrine to its apex of efficiency. Casualty counts per implementation had been reduced through the adoption of partial sterilization protocols, allowing the Imperium to generate equivalent psychological pressure while preserving some productive capacity on target worlds. Survivor populations were carefully maintained and monitored, their testimonies harvested and distributed with the same precision as official propaganda. The randomized implementation schedule had proven sustainably effective, maintaining baseline terror without inducing total despair or psychological collapse. Rebellion rates across doctrine-affected sectors had dropped to nearly zero. Tithe compliance exceeded targets by an average of 32%. Worker productivity was at historic highs. The strategic objectives had been achieved so completely that new analysts were struggling to identify further optimization opportunities. The Munitorum prepared a comprehensive assessment for review by the High Lords of Terror, a document that ran to 17,000 pages and included detailed analysis of every implementation, every psychological metric, every efficiency gain. The assessment concluded that the Carthax suppression doctrine represented a revolutionary advance in compliance enforcement methodology, that its principles should be incorporated into standard imperial governance protocols, that the success demonstrated over 8 years of implementation justified permanent institutionalization of the approach. The assessment made no moral argument. It did not try to justify the killing or rationalize the cruelty. It simply presented the numbers, the cold mathematical proof that the doctrine worked, that it accomplished strategic objectives more efficiently than any alternative, that the Imperium could govern through calibrated terror more effectively than through faith or force or justice. I was tasked with preparing a summary of the assessment for distribution to regional command staff, a condensed version that highlighted key findings and strategic recommendations. I worked on it for 3 weeks, distilling 17,000 pages into 200, extracting the essential arguments and supporting data, creating a document that conveyed the doctrine's success in clear, accessible language. When I finished, I read it through one final time before submission. 200 pages that explained how the Imperium had learned to govern through optimized atrocity, that detailed methods for maintaining calibrated terror, that recommended the systematic sacrifice of loyal populations for strategic gain. 200 pages that made it all sound reasonable, efficient, necessary. I submitted the document without comment. The response from regional commands was overwhelmingly positive. Requests for doctrine implementation flooded in from sectors that had not yet experienced the methodology, commanders eager to achieve the same compliance gains and efficiency improvements. The Munitorum began drafting expansion protocols, calculating the resource requirements for rolling out the doctrine across entire segmentums, estimating timelines for galaxy-wide implementation. The machine was expanding, the methodology was spreading. What had been tested in a few sectors was metastasizing into standard practice, and still no one spoke about the cost. The 9th year brought the first signs of unexpected consequences. Populations that had been subjected to the doctrine for extended periods began showing behavioral changes that fell outside the analysts' models. Suicide rates spiked across multiple worlds, particularly among younger demographics. Birth rates plummeted as people chose not to bring children into a universe where loyalty meant nothing and death could arrive without warning. Work quality degraded in subtle ways, populations performing their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, but zero initiative, zero creativity, zero engagement beyond minimum compliance. The analysts noted these trends with clinical interest, incorporating them into updated models, calculating the long-term sustainability of doctrine-affected populations. Some argued that the behavioral changes represented acceptable losses, side effects that did not outweigh the strategic benefits. Others expressed concern that prolonged exposure might be creating populations too damaged to remain productive, that there might be a breaking point beyond which calibrated terror became counterproductive. Research teams were commissioned to study the phenomenon, to determine whether the psychological damage could be mitigated without reducing compliance effectiveness, to identify the optimal balance between terror and functionality. I read their preliminary findings in my quarters late one night, reports documenting the systematic psychological destruction of entire populations, the careful measurement of how much horror human minds could sustain before fragmenting beyond usefulness. The researchers approached the problem with the same clinical detachment as everything else, treating human suffering as a variable to be optimized, a resource to be managed. They did not see people, they saw populations. Statistics, compliance indices, resource units. Just like I did when I compiled my reports, just like everyone did who kept the machine running, the truth was simple and terrible. We had all learned to see the galaxy the way the doctrine required us to see it, through the lens of strategic necessity, stripped of moral consideration. We had all been shaped by the methodology we served, our empathy eroded through exposure until we could discuss the optimization of atrocity without flinching, could read casualty statistics without imagining the screaming, could select target worlds knowing we were condemning billions to death. The doctrine had not just changed how the Imperium governed, it had changed us, made us into something capable of maintaining it. The 9th year also brought the first instance of what the analysts called cascade failure, a situation where doctrine implementation triggered unexpected resistance rather than compliance. It occurred on Talvan's Rest, a world that had been subjected to a partial implementation 6 months earlier, where 70% of the population had been killed and the survivors left to rebuild with minimal support. Rather than demonstrating the expected terrorized obedience, the survivors of Talvin's Rest rebelled. Not immediately, not in a way that attracted attention, but slowly and systematically. They sabotaged production equipment, corrupted data archives, introduced subtle errors into manufactured goods. When Imperial monitors arrived to investigate the production irregularities, the population killed them and went into hiding, abandoning surface settlements for the deep mine networks where orbital surveillance could not track them. The Munitorum response was immediate and overwhelming. The remaining population of Talvin's Rest was hunted through the mine networks by Void-trained kill teams, the survivors executed when found, the entire world subjected to a secondary sterilization bombardment that sealed the mines forever. But the damage had been done. Word of Talvin's Rest spread despite information suppression efforts. Survivor testimony from other worlds incorporating the rebellion into their narratives, creating a dangerous counterexample that suggested resistance was possible, that the doctrine could be defied. 3 other worlds attempted similar rebellions within the following 2 months. All were suppressed, all were subjected to total sterilization, all were erased from strategic maps. But the pattern concerned the analysts, suggested that the doctrine might be creating exactly the kind of desperation it was designed to prevent, that there might be a threshold beyond which terror flipped into defiance. Emergency analysis sessions were convened. Models were revised. Protocols were updated to identify worlds at risk of cascade failure before implementation, to screen for populations that might respond to doctrine pressure with resistance rather than compliance. The methodology grew more complex, the targeting algorithms more sophisticated, the psychological profiling more detailed. The Imperium was learning to predict not just which worlds would submit to terror, but which would break in productive versus counterproductive ways, which populations could be pushed to maximum fear without triggering active resistance. The doctrine was adapting, evolving to address new challenges, maintaining its effectiveness through constant refinement. Because that was what it did. That was what we all did. We adapted, we refined, we optimized the machine that transformed loyalty into ash and calculated the strategic value of despair. The 10th year brought the first formal opposition to the doctrine from within the Imperium itself. A senior ecclesiarchy cardinal named Vandrus filed a formal protest with the administratum, arguing that the systematic destruction of faithful populations contradicted the emperor's will, that terror-based governance was theologically unsound, that the doctrine represented a dangerous drift toward nihilism that threatened the spiritual foundation of imperial civilization. His protest was 17 pages long, carefully argued, supported by scriptural references and theological reasoning. It acknowledged the doctrine's effectiveness while arguing that some methods of governance were incompatible with the Imperium's identity as the emperor's domain, that there were lines that should not be crossed regardless of strategic benefit. The response came from the Munitorum within 4 days. Cardinal Vandrus was declared excommunicate, his writings condemned as heretical, his followers arrested and interrogated. He was executed for sedition after a trial that lasted 6 hours, his body displayed in the public plaza of his cathedral world as a warning to others who might question imperial policy. No formal rebuttal to his theological arguments was ever issued. The Imperium simply removed the man who had raised them, demonstrating through action that the doctrine's effectiveness overrode any other consideration, that strategic success justified any methodology, that questioning the machine marked you as an obstacle to be eliminated. The message was clear. The doctrine was beyond debate, beyond moral evaluation, beyond any authority except the cold logic of compliance metrics and casualty ratios. It was policy now, institutionalized, permanent. I thought about Cardinal Vandrus sometimes in the months that followed, about his 17 pages of careful argumentation rendered meaningless by 6 hours of show trial. I wondered if he had believed his protest would make a difference, if he had thought theological reasoning might slow the machine even fractionally. I wondered if he had known he was walking toward execution when he submitted his formal protest. I wondered if he had done it anyway, knowing it was futile, because some part of him could not remain silent even when silence meant survival. I wondered what that kind of moral courage looked like from the inside. The 11th year saw expansion of the doctrine into the segmentum obscurus, targeting regions that had remained outside its influence due to administrative complexity. The implementation followed established protocols: randomized target selection, optimized documentation, calculated survivor ratios, comprehensive psychological impact analysis. 17 worlds died that year across multiple sectors. Their populations ranged from 300 million to 8 billion. Their methods of death varied from orbital bombardment to biological weapons to induced stellar events. Every death was documented, every scream was recorded. Every moment of suffering was catalogued and analyzed and incorporated into the ever-growing database that defined the doctrine's knowledge base. The Munitorum reports for the year showed continued success. Rebellion rates remained near zero. Tithe compliance exceeded projections. Worker productivity maintained historic highs. The behavioral degradation noted in previous years had stabilized at manageable levels, suggesting that populations were adapting to doctrine pressure without complete psychological collapse. The machine was working. The strategy was sustainable. The Imperium had discovered a method of governance that could maintain compliance across billions of souls through the systematic application of mathematically optimized terror, and no one was coming to stop it. No external force would intervene. No internal opposition would succeed where Cardinal Vandrus had failed. The doctrine would continue because it worked, because effectiveness was the only metric that mattered in an Imperium fighting infinite wars across infinite fronts, because the strategic value of calibrated cruelty outweighed any moral cost. I sat in my quarters on the final night of the 11th year, reading through the annual assessment report, and I understood with sudden clarity that this would never end. That the doctrine would continue implementation after implementation, year after year, world after world, each death optimized for maximum strategic effect. That analysts would keep refining the methodology, fleet captains would keep carrying out the strikes, picked feed operators would keep editing the footage. That the machine would continue grinding through loyal populations, transforming them into statistical abstractions, converting their deaths into compliance metrics. That I would continue filing reports and attending planning sessions and offering technical observations, my role in the machine as essential as anyone else's, my complicity as complete as the analysts who selected targets or the gunners who pulled the triggers. Because we were all part of the same mechanism, all components serving the same function, all participants in the systematic transformation of imperial governance into something that could calculate the strategic value of children burning. The horror was not that the doctrine existed. The horror was that it worked, that it achieved its objectives, that no alternative methodology could match its efficiency or effectiveness, that the Imperium had discovered the optimal strategy for maintaining compliance, and that strategy required the deliberate sacrifice of billions of loyal souls in service of mathematically optimized despair. The horror was that we had all adapted to it, that it had become normal, routine, just another policy among the thousands that kept the Imperium functioning, that we could discuss the optimization of atrocity over lunch and move on to other topics without pause, could read casualty statistics without flinching, could watch worlds die and think primarily about whether the documentation had captured sufficient detail. The horror was that somewhere in the depths of the Munitorum, analysts were already drafting plans for the 12th year, selecting new targets, calculating optimal strike timings, refining the protocols that would govern the next round of implementations. The horror was that the machine would continue, that it would always continue. Because it worked. I turned off the data slate and sat in darkness, listening to the hum of the fortress's machinery, the distant vibration of plasma conduits and ventilation systems, all the invisible infrastructure that kept this place functioning. Somewhere far above, fleet ships were being loaded with munitions that would eventually sterilize worlds whose names I did not yet know. Somewhere far below, analysts were running calculations that would determine which populations would die in the coming year. Somewhere across the Imperium, Billions of people were laboring in the Emperor's name, unaware that their loyalty meant nothing, that they existed only as variables in an equation that calculated the strategic value of their deaths. The doctrine had proven that compliance could be purchased with horror, that rebellion could be suppressed through mathematically engineered despair, that the Imperium could rule not through faith or justice, but through the cold manipulation of psychological breaking points. It had proven that this approach was more efficient than conventional warfare, more cost-effective than traditional suppression campaigns, more sustainable than methods that required ongoing military presence. It had proven that the systematic sacrifice of loyal populations generated better strategic outcomes than protecting them. And because it worked, because the numbers justified the methodology, because effectiveness overrode every other consideration, the doctrine would continue until the Imperium itself fell, or until every human soul had learned to live in the permanent shadow of calibrated terror. There would be no intervention, no redemption, no moment when the Imperium would recognize what it had become and choose a different path. There was only the machine and the metrics and the endless optimization of cruelty in service of compliance. I thought about the first planet again, Carthax Prime, about the 3 billion souls who had died without understanding why, who had prayed to the God Emperor as their world burned, who had believed until the end that loyalty would save them. I thought about all the worlds that had followed, all the populations that had been erased, all the prayers that had gone unanswered, all the faith that had proven worthless measured against strategic necessity. I thought about the worlds that had not yet died, but whose names were already on lists being compiled in Munitorum offices, whose populations were already condemned even if they did not know it yet, whose destruction was already factored into next year's strategic projections. I thought about how the doctrine would be remembered, assuming anyone remained to remember it. Whether it would be seen as a necessary evil, a tragic but justified response to impossible circumstances. Whether future historians would acknowledge the moral cost or simply note the effectiveness, the way the strategy had stabilized entire sectors and prevented countless rebellions. Whether any record would survive that captured not just the strategic success but the screaming, the prayers, the children crying in the dark as their world ended around them. Whether anyone would care. The data slate remained dark in my lap. Outside my window, the void stretched endlessly, filled with stars that represented worlds uncounted, each one a potential target, each population a variable in the algorithm that calculated the strategic value of despair. The doctrine would continue because it worked. That was the only truth that mattered, the only metric the Imperium recognized. And so worlds would keep dying, populations would keep being sacrificed, the machine would keep grinding through loyal souls in service of compliance metrics and resource optimization. Because effectiveness justified anything, because strategic success excused any atrocity, because the Imperium had learned to govern through mathematically optimized cruelty and discovered that this approach was more efficient than any alternative. The doctrine was a success. The reports proved it, the numbers confirmed it, the continued expansion validated it. 40 billion dead across 11 years, and rebellion rates had dropped to nearly zero. Tithe compliance exceeded all projections. The Imperium had discovered that it could rule through terror more effectively than through faith, that fear properly calibrated could replace armies, that the systematic sacrifice of the innocent generated better strategic outcomes than protecting them. The doctrine worked. It worked because it removed humanity from the equation, because it transformed people into statistics, because it calculated the optimal application of horror with the same precision other strategists applied to void combat or armored assault. It worked because we let it work, because we adapted to it, because we became the kind of people capable of maintaining it. Because at the end of every calculation, after all the analysis and projection and optimization, someone had to give the order, someone had to authorize the strike. Someone had to watch the world burn and document the screaming and compile it all into reports that would justify the next implementation. And we did. All of us. the analysts and the fleet captains and the administrators and the picked feed operators and everyone else who kept the machine running. We became what the doctrine required us to be: efficient, effective, detached, complicit. The machine would continue because we would continue, because there was no force within the Imperium capable of stopping it, no authority that would override strategic effectiveness with